Hi, you're watching BloombergQuint as we come to you from the World Economic Forum's annual meeting here in Davos. I'm joined today with John Chipman, DG and CEO of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and we're going to talk about global leadership over the course of this decade. John, thank you so much for speaking to us at BloombergQuint. Last year, IISS released a report, this was late last year, where it warned of fragmented international landscape. This is something we've come to accept now in the last few years, especially with the standoff between the US and China. How would you expand on that to give us a sense of what this decade will bring in terms of global leadership or the lack of it?
Well, what we think is at the beginning of 2020, what we've really seen is the atomization of international society. Institutions have been marginalized. Neither balance of power nor a rules-based order have been ordering principles for international affairs. There's been a sense of strategic self-determination. In the 1960s and 70s, it was all about political self-determination, where countries decided to become independent and were able to be sovereign over their own domestic politics. But now a number of countries around the world are expressing their strategic personality in a very national way, which means that there's a lot of chaos in the international system, especially in circumstances in which the United States has decided to retreat from international engagement, has said to its principal European allies in NATO, you're not paying enough, and is then trying to charge its Asian allies, whether the Koreans or the Japanese, several multiples of what they already pay for US bases. So in these circumstances, we feel that an ordered multipolar world is not yet there. Statecraft is back. National foreign policy matters, but also the foreign policy that might be pursued by companies, by NGOs, and others, as we try to find a new equilibrium in this very atomized international society.
And in this the search for a new equilibrium, what role will the US play? Will it be anything similar to the role it's played in the last few decades, or maybe all the way back to the 60s and the 50s, or will it be a completely different role?
In one sense, the United States still remains, as it were, the geopolitical swing player. That is, if it decides to engage, its engagement can be pretty dispositive of the case, and if it decides to withdraw, it leaves a vacuum that is pretty important that no one can automatically fill. So it's still a geopolitical swing player. We saw what happened when they decided to restore deterrence in the Middle East by the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Al-Quds force, whose machine that he built in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen was really what was changing the effective balance of power in the Middle East. Now that's been a little bit stalled, and Iran is now thinking of coming back into discussions to de-escalate, and perhaps the Europeans and the Americans will now find a new modus vivendi for Iran. So it made a difference what the United States makes. The question really is can the US be relied upon in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, even in Latin America and Africa, and that is what is being questioned.
Can they?
Well, for the moment they say that it's up to others to take more share of their own security concerns, that they need to be not such great net importers of US security. It's really important for countries in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, to still find ways to engage with the United States to ensure that it can continue to provide a public good of international security, because some of the new players on the block, it's not yet clear that their main goal is to provide a public good of international security as opposed to just defend their economic interests and ensure their own spheres of influence. Spheres of influence politics are going to be hard, but Russia and Eurasia, Iran in the Middle East, to a degree China in Asia, do want regional countries to pay tribute to them, and if the US withdraws completely, those powers in those regions will have a bit more influence.
Okay, I want to talk both about the Middle East situation as well as China relative to the US. In the Middle East, it did look like things were going to escalate for a bit, and now they seem to have calmed down. Is this a false calm? Will the Middle East be a different picture this 10 years, or will it be more of the same that we've seen in the past?
Well, in the Middle East, and especially amongst the Gulf Arab states, there was a concern before that the United States would not doing none of the big 3Ds. It wasn't doing defense, it wasn't doing deterrence, and it wasn't doing diplomacy. This targeted killing of Soleimani has meant that at least they've restored for a period of time deterrence, because Iran, from the point of view of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others, was getting away with a lot of murder itself. And this has made them press the pause button a little bit. It will be very important to see if there are negotiations again between the United States and Iran in some way. I don't think Iran wants to escalate. I'm sure the United States doesn't wish to escalate. Iran knows that it cannot win a conventional war with the United States. It's why it's always chosen unconventional means to prosecute its interests in the region. And I think what the region wants is to contain those unconventional means, because Iran's use of proxies and partners and other allies in the region is what has changed the effective balance of forces in the Middle East. It's not been its nuclear program, it's not been its ballistic missile program, it's been this other activity, and that will be the issue. Can the Europeans, the Americans, the Gulf Arabs talk to Iran about that activity?
If I understood the Obama years correctly, John, it was about, bringing the troops back home from the Middle East. And now the U.S. has deployed even more troops to the Middle East. At one point, a few years ago, it seemed that U.S. intervention in the Middle East was on the wane, and now it looks like it's on the rise. It's tough to tell what the next 10 years will bring and whether the Middle East will continue to remain this zone of trouble and political instability.
Well, you're right to identify the beginning of a psychological and physical withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East with the Obama administration. This was the country that talked about leading from behind in the Libya case, for example. So President Trump has acted compliant with a trend in the United States that has really questioned whether providing this amount of Middle East security, putting so many boots on the ground, is really vital for America's national interests, especially at a time when America is becoming a net oil exporter and isn't itself dependent on flow of oil from the Middle East. But of course, its principal allies in Asia are very dependent on that flow of oil from the Middle East. So there's still an argument in the United States that if we're going to be loyal to our Asian allies, we still have to provide our share of security for the Middle East in order to sustain that strong relationships with our Asian friends.
How do you see the position of China relative to the U.S., which has been so far the global leadership, and it's a position that China hopes to be in sometime soon? And what does it mean for countries like India, which neighbor China and ally with the U.S.?
Well, China, of course, famously wants a multipolar world, but it's campaigning for a unipolar Asia. It wants, as many countries in Asia, to pay it the respect, give it the tribute that a century and a half of humiliation had denied China. So a lot of its foreign policy about the restoration of national pride. But it remains the case that it is having more ambitions executed through its Belt and Road Initiative. Very important, since we're interested in talking also about technology, and you and India are very interested in technology. People talk about the ports and the railroads and the roads in the Belt and Road Initiative, but the really dramatic thing of the Belt and Road Initiative is the digital Silk Road, is the way in which China is trying to build smart cities, fiber optic cables for 5G, e-commerce with the countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and the data that China will gather from that will make it a data superpower. Because remember, at present, China is able to gather the data from its own 1.4 billion citizens, but that data is relatively homogeneous. When they begin developing data from Africa, from Southeast Asia and the rest, heterogeneous data makes China a data superpower. And that is, I think, something that we all have to be aware of.
What do countries like India do? I think, this is a question that has faced our foreign policy for a very long time. We are sympathetic, or were once a Russia ally, then a U.S. ally, can't ignore the China climb towards, leadership in Asia. Indian foreign policy should reflect what? What are the choices left for us?
I think the main shift of Indian foreign policy was explained very well by your Foreign Minister Jai Shankar at your excellent Raisina dialogue that is hosted every year, in which he said India will move to be a shaper and move away from being an abstainer. It's true that India will still be a great champion for the global South. That's part of the Indian DNA. But it will move away from a formal non-aligned position. It will develop a strategic personality of its own. It's already developing stronger relations in its neighborhood, but India needs to comport itself in the Indo-Pacific, and it is why India was invited to join many years ago the East Asia Summit, because the countries of the region wanted India there if China was going to be there, along with the United States and other regional powers. So I think India needs to express its strategic personality more in the Indo-Pacific. It's interesting interesting that ASEAN states have now accepted the appellation of the Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for India to become a little bit of more of a shaper, a stronger defender of the rules-based order from which it has benefited, and countries in Southeast Asia and the rest of the Indo-Pacific, I think, will welcome an extrovert strategic India in their region.
Despite the recent domestic politics that we've seen in India?
Of course, I mean, domestic politics have absorbed a great deal of Indian political attention. There are challenges and questions about constitutional issues and the like. But overall, India is still perceived as the world's largest democracy, a country that is very diverse and needs to respect different points of views, but is at a moment in its own economic development where the political personality needs to align a little bit more closely with the economic power that it's wielding. And it can do that comfortably within the G20 environment, and I think that is where we will see India developing more of a foreign policy approach. All I can say is that in Europe and in North America, people look to India to play a larger role, so it will be received in the international marketplace of foreign policy very warmly if it chooses to take up
and none of that
stance.
is diminished by the recent domestic politics that we've seen, or the amendments to the citizenship bill, or the perception that India might be discriminating against some religions.
Of course, these questions have been raised in international fora and by a number of countries, but I think the broad strategic lines of Indian foreign policy are still very permissive for a generous Indian role in international affairs, and particularly in defending and advancing the rules-based order that has been so diminished in the last few years.
All right, and one last final question, and I think this goes to many of the conversations you're having here in Davos as well. You spoke of Iran not wanting or not being able to ever win a conventional war with the US, but there is nothing conventional about wars anymore, and tech wars are really the flavor of the season, if I may put it that way. You've spoken extensively of the threat around this. Can you talk our viewers through what this decade will unfold in terms of tech supremacy, tech wars, and that goes to your point on China's Belt and Road Initiative and the data collection and the data supremacy as well?
We are at the cusp of a technological Cold War. You have the United States that still wants to defend its big ICT giants and a free and open internet. You have Russia wanting to create an internal intranet of its own. You have China focusing on internal security and its great firewall. All this will be played out in the 5G debate. And the important question about 5G is, will we be able to accommodate different suppliers in the 5G environment? Or are we going to create a situation where China will have its 5G, the Europeans will have its own, the Americans will, perhaps in a delayed fashion, enter the 5G universe? Because if that happens, then we move from an internet to a splinternet. And the global economy really depends on a global internet, on the global sharing of data in order to ensure that financial transactions and an awful lot of other healthy things happen. The problem was that we never really set proper standards for 5G, so we weren't able to test what companies like Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson had to do in order to satisfy certain regulations. And while all these companies have filed all sorts of 5G patents, none have filed really important patents on the security element, and that, I think, is a great concern. My hope is that somehow we'll be able to manage over the next couple of years and be able to develop trusted relationships with 5G suppliers. The United Kingdom has done quite well, where our signals intelligence agency, GCHQ, got to know Huawei quite well through the 3G and 4G period. It looks at all the Huawei code. When they see bugs in it, they demand that Huawei fix them. Other countries perhaps need to find some way through this difficult area. But if we haven't solved the 5G problem, at least let's start working on 6G, because in 10 years' time, we will be boarding the 6G ship, and when we board the 6G ship, we need to have proper standards, proper security protocols, proper understanding about how data flows in a trusted way.
Just one quick follow-up to that. this internet to splinternet phrase that you used, what are the chances, what is the probability of countries like Russia or China saying, hey, I want to have my own internet?
Well, we've already heard Russia talking about wanting to ensure that anybody who deals with Russia has data localization. And most people...
But India's asking for the same thing.
It's true. The problem with data localization is two things. One, it's much more expensive. And second, it's not necessarily more secure. If you talk to the big companies that manage financial transactions, like the credit card companies, they might have 20,000 employees, they might have 1,000 people who work on cybersecurity. That's a good 5%. But if they need to then provide the security for local servers, they're going to have to quadruple or quintuple their cybersecurity experts, and it's not necessarily better for security to have data localization.
So that's what you mean by a splinternet, by data localization and countries wanting to control some aspects of the data highway?
Well, it's that, but it's also the idea that if the internet is balkanized, if it's not free-flowing throughout all the geographies in North America, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, if it bumps up against walls of different kinds, then the advantages that 5G would deliver to our economies is lost.
John, thank you so much for the insights, and thank you for your conversation here in Davos.
Thank you.
Thank you.